Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you to the Shackhouse. David is a dear and close friend and a real role model in a profession. Law professors where anivut, humility, and kind of quiet dedication is very, very far from the norm. David really is a role model in many ways, but not only those who know him in shul, but knowing him in the context of his profession, of our profession, truly, truly unique and amazing individual, and very much davening for Refuah Shlema. So thank you for the Tehillim, Rabbi. So I want to talk tonight about, as the title somewhat inelegantly says, COVID, Halacha, the Supreme Court, and the shifting fault lines of American Orthodoxy. If you're wondering how all these connect, don't worry. My mother asked me the same question. But I think they do, and I think they tell an interesting story, both about halacha, how it works, and different views about how it works. And as we move into the Supreme Court, different views about what it means to be Jewish or maybe Orthodox in America, and the relationship between halacha and American law and the way we think about those has come to light, I think, in recent months in a way that's been very interesting to watch. So that'll be our project here. Just a little bit of an outline. So there's a joke that runs around online that future historians will ask, which week of 2020 were you an expert in? Because there's of course been so much going on. So by this point already, we have to remind ourselves of the history of what happened. So I want to kind of divide the talk tonight, or the share, into three categories. One, what I call early COVID, so the first couple months when things were being set, looking at what halachic issues came up, what halachic responses came up, and what trend lines we can learn from there. And then kind of transitioning to the sort of late summer and fall, where I'll think about the shifting fault lines in American Orthodoxy and how our community, broadly defined, has somewhat changed and reconfigured itself in light of COVID. And then finally, look at the last couple of weeks, including a decision that came down yesterday on what I'll call Orthodox COVID litigation. That is, groups in New York primarily challenging up to the Supreme Court the state of New York's regulations on shuls about the number of people that could be in there and the percentage of capacity that could be allowed. So that's sort of our plan. So just to remind everybody, I want to start at the beginning, which is, COVID came to the East Coast, or at least one of the main vectors that it came to the East Coast was actually through the Frum and specifically the modern Orthodox community. And again, you guys all probably remember this, but just bring it back to the kind of top of our consciousness that it was probably spread in the combination of the APAC conference and the CPAC conferences that were in early March. And then, this case of this person in a firm show in Scarsdale became like one of the patient zeros in the New York area. And because of that, SAR, right, the high school, grade school and high school in Riverdale, and YU were some of the first institutions to close in quarantine. I believe Yeshiva University was the first university to close about a week or two before that started spreading nationally. And on March 12th, the RCBC, the Rabbinical Council of Bergen County, that's Teaneck and its the Gliloteha and its surrounding area, issued a letter that I think turned out to be quite prescient and quite influential in how other communities behaved, and signaled sort of how at least a certain segment of Orthodoxy was going to approach this. So just, RCBC, that's Teaneck, almost all of its rabbis are YU Musmachim, and it's very reflective of the sort of Yeshiva University and the REITs, the yeshiva part there, of their way of thinking about it. So I want to look at that letter and then kind of pick up some trends from it. I'm going to try to zoom in here. So remember, this is March 12th, so this is really or maybe even just before things are closing down. And I would say shortly after this letter release, the Rabbanim in our community, I think the next day, released a letter sort of, touching on many of the same themes, but I think this is really one of the first ones in a template. So it says that they're writing with an update about the COVID situation, and they say that the rabbis met with, and I want to pay attention who's meeting, the rabbis, the presidents of the shul, the head of the schools, so that's like the sort of Jewish contingent, meet with representatives of local government, and with physicians and leaders from 3 hospitals. So right there, we were watching an interesting form of leadership come about. We've got, within the Jewish community, we've got rabbis, shul presidents, and schools, and then that group meets with government and with sort of medical expertise. And they basically say that, look, here's what we're hearing, that we're afraid that the resources will be overwhelmed, right? This is back when everyone was thinking about flatten the curve. And they basically explain what that is, and that therefore what we're worried about is that people who would otherwise make, and it's important to recall what the flatten the curve logic is. It says, listen, people are going to get sick, and certainly at that point we don't have any good treatment. But if everyone gets sick at once, right, it's going to overwhelm the resources, and there are going to be worse outcomes. Whereas if we kind of elongate the period over which people may get sick, people will still get sick, and some people will still not do well. But the medical system will be able to work, do its work more effectively and save some marginal number of people. And that's what they explain. And therefore they say we make the very difficult decision to social distance, etc., and to basically close down the community. And if we look here on the next page, they tell you what that means. Of course, to us now, this is all familiar, but let's try to get our heads back into March and remember just how unusual this was. So work from home, stay at home, schools are closed, no play dates, shul and minyan is closed, and then, not just for, the rabbis themselves are going to be davening at home, no house minyanim, daven individually, no smachot, public celebrations, don't have people over for Shabbos meals, change the way we do shiva visits, change the levayas, refrain from contact sports, restaurants should close, and then we'll come to mikvahs will remain open. We'll come back to mikvahs in a moment. So these are obviously big changes, but this is what we got to do, and this is on the advice of the doctors and the CDC, and we will monitor this, and we hope they're temporary measures, and ending, of course, with a little bit of a tefillah. So that's their letter, and again, at the moment, this doesn't seem so surprising, but if we try to get our heads back to that period, this was actually quite surprising. This letter came out a couple of days before this became the trend. And this way, I think the rabbis of Teaneck were ahead of the ball nationally for sure, and maybe even in their location. I think in part because it hit that community first. So just to kind of pick up on the themes, the authority they speak in is some combination of medical, rabbinic, lay Jewish, and governmental, right? You got the rabbis, you got the shul presidents, you got the hospital heads, and you've got the leadership there, the government. The goal, of course, is to conserve the medical resources, or what became known as flatten the curve. And this is really a reassertion of an older model of Jewish leadership that certainly in more modern Orthodox communities probably waned, which is they're acting like the kahal, right? They're acting like the community, right? Officially, these are a collection of shul rabbis. So we say, okay, the shul rabbis are in charge of stuff that happens in shul. So they're going to close minyans. And maybe you could say, all right, because they give either directly or indirectly the hashgachos, they're going to close the restaurants. And maybe you say, well, because directly or indirectly, they kind of are involved in the schools. But, they say things like don't have play dates, don't play contact sports, and work from home. These are things that, under no definition, or certainly no narrow definition, come under the rabbinic purview, right, in the narrow sense of the term of, the rabbi of our shul or the rabbi or rabbis of collections of shul. And yet, they're kind of taking this proactive step sort of outside of the zone of the shul to really act like a kahal, right, like a kind of community, and to speak to the government and to speak to the medical establishment and to come up with these guidelines. I think the impact of this letter was quite significant. because it signals to the world what the sort of YU REITs policy is going to be. And basically, we're going to take this seriously and we're going to follow the medical advice. And that's why I think, I don't want to speak for the rabbi, but it's not surprising that within a couple hours, a not so different letter came out here locally. And I know that was true all over the country, to some degree relying on the fact that these rabbis talked to their rebbeim and whatnot and decided that this is the way they're going to do it. And in terms of the outcomes, I think you can't underestimate this letter. Our community, Baruch Hashem, certainly in the initial rounds, had much, much, much better outcomes than they did in Teaneck, because I think the virus was a couple of days behind, but we got this letter and acted upon it. Now, in this period, so I think that's sort of one point that you see here from like the YU community, a sense that this is really serious. This is a pikuach nefesh idea, and we're gonna take it that way, and we're gonna close down the shuls and close down the schools. Again, things that would have seemed unthinkable even 2 weeks before that happened, or maybe even a few days before that happened. And that was really before, my university closed like 2 days later. Really before this was happening in the culture at large. If we look to what's going on there, what we see in this phase is what I would call an evolution of the idea of pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh, just to remind everybody, is the idea that one can violate basically all but a few mitzvot or averot in the Torah in order to save a life. Pikuach nefesh. Traditionally, in the halacha, in the classic halacha, what pikuach nefesh means is that there's an acute danger in front of you, right? So let's take the case, I'm walking to shul on Shabbos, and I see someone fall down in front of me, injured or having a heart attack or something. So at that point, of course, I can violate any and all Hilchos Shabbos to get the person to an ambulance, to the hospital, etc. But the classic cases are like that. They're acute emergencies that happen in front of you. It's been already maybe in the last 70, 80 years, maybe even a little bit more. The concept has expanded somewhat to account for what I would call medical preparedness, right? So particularly in Israel, you're running a hospital system, so you can't just react to something in front of you, but you have to plan. And in fits and starts, pikuach nefesh has generally been expanded to one degree or another to cover, maintaining and running a hospital structure, maintaining and running the healthcare structure, right? Even things like the sewage lines, the water lines, the power lines, particularly in Israel, all these things which are not, there's an emergency right in front of me, but if we don't do it, something somewhere is going to go wrong, and that's going to cause someone, a potentially debilitating disease, and therefore we can cover it for that. I think in the COVID era, it probably went even another step, because remember the logic of flatten the curve. The logic of flatten the curve says, I'm going to do this now because if I don't in the future, some people will get sick, but that would probably happen anyway. The point is, so many people would get sick so that statistically, the medical system is going to become overloaded, and therefore more people will possibly die than they would have otherwise. Right, so that's really to apply pikuach nefesh to the logic, particularly in early Corona, took those steps, and we see that I would say it was slow and then fast. Meaning, I think that the YU community came out with this first. Initially, there was some, I think, hesitancy on the ultra-Orthodox and Haredi community, but as unfortunately deaths and fatalities started to pile up in Brooklyn, Monsey, and Lakewood, by just around Pesach, you saw virtually every community come out with some view of the idea that the COVID restrictions entail pikuach nefesh. Now I want to look to some of the and call early, basically the period from Purim and Pesach till the summer, of decisions, of halachic decisions made regarding COVID, and particularly to think about what I call the style or the structure of the halachic reasoning behind these. So I divided it here into kind of three categories, other ones, but you'll see that they're all similar in a certain way. So let's start with Pesach, which was, clearly very early on, and one of the main events, so to speak, in the COVID era. So as we know, every year we typically gather together to burn our chametz. Right? When I was a kid, we used to burn it in our front yard, and I guess it's decided that's too dangerous, so now we do it sort of communally with firefighters watching, and people know what they're doing. In the halacha, I think it's fair to say that is the best way to do it. That is the most ideal, the most echatchil way to do it. But already in the Mishnah, and then from then on down, says, listen, there are other ways to dispose of your chametz, right? You can mifar l'ruach, you can kind of grind it up and let the wind take it, right? You can maybe flush it down the toilet, zorko layam. So there are other ways to do it. So what you saw is that the psakim, and we'll come to the two leading poskim in this era, in this area, which were here in America, Herschel Schechter, and in Israel, Rav Asher Weiss, of course, others. Basically said, okay, it's true. Every year, ideally, you burn the chametz because there's something sort of more visceral about the burning. But, halachically, disposing otherwise is certainly fine. And therefore, now we're in some form of a shatat chak. It's dangerous to gather. And maybe if we gather, people will say, oh, why are these Jews gathering? Rav Schechter wrote that, like, even if it's safe, people's going to look bad. And therefore, get rid of the chametz in another way. Ideally, you sell the chametz, you meet with the rabbi, you enact a kinyan in person. He gives you a pen or a handkerchief. Usually you pick it up, and that way you authorize the rabbi to sell your chametz. But okay, this year we could do that over Zoom. The fast of the firstborn, Tainus Bechoros. Again, usually for a siyum, you want to be present in the same place. All right, but this year we could use Zoom for that. Dishes, right? Typically you take, not technically a Pesach halacha, but when you get new dishes, you got to take them to the mikveh. But there are ways not to. You can have in mind that a guy will own them. There's different ways around that. Usually we don't like to rely on it, but here we are in this situation. We're going to do that. Moving to shul life, so we all know lots of things were done to what I would call decrease the footprint of shul. So even when shul opened, right, like we're doing now, we start it on Shabbos at Shulchan or at Yishtamach, right? So the Psukei de Zimra, you say yourself. We take out Anim Zmirot. We take out the drasha. We take out the singing, or we minimize it. We have our special Aliyah procedure. LMS was zocha to have a special video explaining how to do the Aliyah procedure to minimize the contact. Other shuls just had it that the Baal Korah gets all the Aliyahs. And then, maybe if you think of most dramatically in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, so we say, listen, our machzor, it has the core that's really from the Mishnah, the Malchi, Zichros, and Shofros. And then it's got a lot of piyutim. The piyutim are nice, they're beautiful, they structure, meaning we like the tunes. But fundamentally, those are additions. So the rule was, each shul, how they saw fit, they figured out which piyutim they're going to not say, and made sure to stick to the core, which is, of course, the blowing of the shofar and the recitation of the Malchi, Zichros, Shofros in Musaf, and of course the regular shachars. If we go to Tisha B'Av, so for example, davening was not done on Zoom, of the feeling that you can't have tefillah b'tzibur on Zoom. But what happened in LMS, right, is that, and in many shuls I think did the same thing. Normally we would sit in shul and do the keynotes. Here, after Kriyas Torah, most people went home, and the keynote were done largely via Zoom. So there are others, but here's what I think is important structurally about the way this all worked, which is there's a very keen awareness of the halachic construct of each of these actions that we do, and to say, look, we need to be mechalik, we need to be distinguished between what is the chatchila, what is the optimal ideal, what is b'diavad okay, what is okay in Shas and Chak? What is a Doraita? What is a Dorabanan? What is a Minhag, an ancient Minhag? What is a new Minhag? What is a Midat Chasidut? What is like the the optimal way to do it, and what is just minhag olam, this is what people do, right? So for so an example, right? So for the kids to sing Anim Zmiris and Adon Olam, that's not even a minhag. It's just like it's part of, I would say, the cultural tapestry of Orthodoxy. So those things are going to be the first to go, and then they're going to sort of like work your way up until you hit something serious, right? And then you're going to have to weigh and balance, so that there's a deep sense in all these psukim that we talked about between what are the baseline halachic requirements, the sort of, this is what you got to do to be yotzei, versus what are the various hidurim, chumras, minhagim, whatever it is, that accreted over the centuries, and an understanding of which one of those are required and which one not. And then what the rabbis basically did is they put out their scales, their balancing scales, and said, okay, we've got on the one hand a pikuach nefesh or a suffix pikuach nefesh because of everything embedded and coming together. On the other hand, we have these halachic values. So, if it's just a minhag, that's going to be able to go easier. And as we move sort of up the scale, we're going to need more to push it off. And therefore, if you look at all these psukim, almost nothing deoraita was implicated, not even sort of like very strong derabbanans. Most of these changes were at the level of minhag, of good practice, of things that have accumulated, but otherwise not that much. And you see why I'm focusing on this method of analysis. I think this is the correct halachic way to do it, right? And we'll talk later about a wedding, right? So maybe just as an example. So really, you need 2 eidim at a wedding. That's it. And then, midirabanan, you probably need 10 people. All right. And then after that, every additional person makes it a bigger party. You're mesameach chatan v'kala, right? But as you expand the circle, if you think about it, 2 is a kind of almost like red line, not a wedding beyond that. 10 is probably, when sort of well regarded, long-standing derabanan. And beyond that is sort of like custom, and you could give halachic voice to that custom by calling it mesameach chatan v'kala, right? Same thing with shul, right? So of course you need 10, right? Now beyond 10, you could say, look, birov am hadrat melech, right? That there's an idea that the bigger the minyan, the more kavod it is. And that's not a halachic value, right? But if you put that against pikuach nefesh is going to win easily. Even minyan itself, right? You can argue. So I would say the method of analysis here was very much to say what is essential versus what is optimal. And here we are in a shas chak, and therefore we're going to focus on the essential, and some of the like lechatchila optimal things we're going to say not this year. Now, just a couple comparisons to bring this home, and I said we talk about mikvahs, so that's probably a good one. So men's mikvahs, which are, I would say, in our community, probably most common for Erev Rosh Hashanah of Erev Yom Kippur. Some people have a minhag every Erev Shabbos, some more Hasidic communities every day, right? Versus women's mikvah. Okay, so women's mikvah is what I would say is one of those core, red line deoraitas. And as you saw already, as far back as the RCBC letter, and then in our community, and then the OU, right, figured out says that we can't not have women go to the mikvah. So we're going to spend a lot of time and effort to figure out how to do it in the safest way possible. By contrast, men's going to the mikvah, which exists on a much less severe halachic plane, most mikvahs said, I think the one here said, at least for the time being, we're suspending men's mikvahs. Same thing, right? If you think about Kaddish over Zoom versus minyan over Zoom. So different communities and rabbis came out differently, but they said, look, you can't have minyan over Zoom, but if there's a minyan meeting in person, could someone saying Kaddish Zoom in? Some rabbis said that's okay. So even the things that didn't change, I think you get a sense that is very much hewing to this line of how serious is the halachic weight on one hand versus how important is the pikuach nefesh on the other, and looking to balance that. And I would say that's the ethos of this trend. As I mentioned, the 2 poskim who I think took this on most comprehensively. So the first one I'll talk about is Rav Asher Weiss. He lives in Eretz Yisrael, although he has a audience in America. He was here in our show, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years ago. He's actually coming out with a shoot of Minchas Asher Corona. It's going to be some 600-page book with many halachic shaylas and hashkafic issues and sort of drushes, all, as he said, tchilato v'leidato be-corona. In other words, it was initiated and it is gestated and finally giving birth in corona. A lot of what he's doing is what I would think in the public health sector we would call community engagement. In other words, you need someone to translate these norms, these social distancing norms, these closing things down norms into the language that the community will understand. He's speaking to a halachic community, and therefore a lot of what he did was basically say, look, we're not doing this because of government mandate. We're not doing this because of either in America or in Israel, right? We're doing this because this is the halacha. And he gave this, he must have given a version this year, I don't know, 1,000 times in the last 9 months. I think to me the most amazing thing is every time he says it with the same degree of sincerity and equanimity, even though he must be sick of saying the same thing over and over because he's trying to get people to listen. And he shows that, the Gemara and Baba Kama and Saiman Shulchan Aruch, Sefer Shulchan Aruch, all basically say, independent of any medical, governmental directives, that in the time of a magef, of a plague, you have to take care of yourself. You have to hide inside. You can't breathe the bad air, etc. And a lot of what he's doing is interpreting that into halachic language. Another thing that he'd been talking about is sort of distinguishing in the role of rabbinic halachic knowledge and health expertise and making healthcare determinations. And him and Rav Schachter said the same thing, that there are questions that are halacha, there are questions that are medicine. It's very important to know where one starts and where one ends, and for each domain of expertise to stay within its lane. And then really he also went very publicly, right, and would always walk around with a mask and close his own shuls and his own kolos, because there's of course not just what the healthcare guidance is, but sort of the modeling and the communal norm setting. And he was engaged in all that, as well as issuing many of those psukim we talked about. Here in America, Rav Hershel Schachter, and I think substantively, they have slightly different ways of analyzing things. Substantively, they don't come out very differently on too much. But he had been talking a lot about prioritizing Dina de Malchut Dina and healthcare regulations. Healthcare regulations are part of Dina Malchut Dina and therefore halachically required for people to keep. Again, respect medical science versus those who oppose it, saying, look, when there's a debate amongst doctors, halacha follows the rove, the majority, and therefore you follow the majority of doctors who practice in this field. And very much the psukim we talked about are very much influenced by this mode of thought. I think for both of these rabbis, particularly more for Rabbi Schachter, there is I think an interesting, quite commendable phenomenon. And as the summer wore on, and I would say COVID regulations became more and more part of the grist of the political mill in America, certainly once Trump sort of came out the way he did on them and everything that comes with that, these rabbis generally resisted that. In other words, they said, look, this is a halachic question. This is not a political question. And I know both nationally and to some degree locally, there was a lot of pressure and the pressure is coming from the fact that, there's a lot of political movement out there and a lot of political anxiety out there, and immediately everything became a statement of who you are. And I think the leadership these rabbis displayed was sort of blocking that all out and saying, listen, argue about politics, at your virtual Shabbos tables or whatnot. But these are just halachic questions about pikuach nefesh on the one hand, and the halachic requirements on the other hand, and really block that out. I think in a way, even though I think, many of these rabbis live in a world in which sort of following those political winds would have probably been easier in terms of the communal role and communal politics, and generally block that out. Now this leads to, I'll have to change this around. I'm going to try this. I think for this slide, it'll work better if I do it this way. Sorry. See what will happen here. So this will get us to part 2, which I'll call the shifting fault lines of American Orthodoxy. Now, I'll start with the caveat as of like all representations, I'm deeply oversimplifying here, and there's many exceptions, but I think this is a useful enough sort of tool to help us understand what's going on. So, here's my continuum, going from white to black, of course, of basically American Orthodoxy, with what we might call open Orthodoxy here on one end of the spectrum, and a sort of ultra Haredi Orthodoxy on the other end of the spectrum. Now, I think of that there's two main coalitions that make up American Orthodoxy. There's what I'll call the Aguda coalition, which basically stretches from WRMO, right-wing modern Orthodoxy, into sort of the Hasidic world. Now, there's probably a bit of the Haredi world that is more to the right of the Aguda, or at least sort of where the mainstream of the Aguda is, but basically covers that spectrum. And then over here is what I'll call the YU RCA OU coalition, sometimes called centrist Orthodoxy or modern Orthodoxy or just Orthodoxy. And that basically stretches from a kind of modern Haredism, right-wing modern Orthodoxy, centrist Orthodoxy, and somewhere into the open Orthodox world. Those are your two main coalitions. As you see, of course, there is a period of overlap, I would say. Right-wing modern Orthodoxy and modern Haredism sort of fit between each. Now, for much of the last 20 years, I would say, one of the main points of debate within Orthodoxy has been what I would call, we could think of them, oh, is this going to work? It's supposed to work. There we go. We would call them questions of gender role and identity. So we're talking about the role of women, particularly in the religious sphere. And then we're talking about questions of sexual orientation and sexuality. And that was, one of the main topics of fissure, of fault lines within Orthodoxy. And the way I drew this up here, this blue arrow, is that if we think of that, the coalition that sort of had more conservative views on this stretched certainly from the Haredi world, but all the way into, probably divided what we call centrist Orthodoxy, and more importantly, broke right in between what I would call the YU RCA OU coalition. Maybe not half-half, probably more like, third, 2/3, or a quarter, 1/4. Exact numbers of here don't matter. But that was a very important fault line. Now, of course, there's all sorts of other fault lines, right? All sorts of other distinctions. But if you think of what people were talking about and what kind of got the communal juices flowing and what people, thought was in the pale and out of the pale and where were you beyond or not, I would think, that's my theory anyway, that this was certainly one of the major issues. And then if we look at that coalition, it basically went like this, and therefore grouping all these people together, right? All these groups together, so much so that a lot of people wondered, is there really any difference between right-wing modern Orthodoxy and Haredism? Have they kind of merged into one group? And there were lots and lots of people who thought that way and talked that way. Of course, there were subtle differences, but on like the big questions of the day, I think there was a lot of truth to that. And to me, what's very interesting that what COVID has done is sort of rejiggered the map, because it put a new set of issues on the board, what I'll sort of maybe inelegantly call the COVID Science Dina de Malchuta Dina coalition. And if you draw the map this way, you get a very different grouping, because now this goes all the way from open Orthodoxy, centrist Orthodoxy, right-wing modern Orthodoxy, modern Haredism, and then begins to taper off as you move over here. More significantly, this cuts through not the YU coalition, but the Aguda coalition. And that, I think a lot of what you see in the last couple of months has been, some members of the Aguda coalition, let's say Rav Asher Weiss, I would say would be the most obvious example, very much on the sort of COVID science, Dina de Malchuta side, Rav Schechter and others. But others in that world, less so, and others quite ambivalent. And, the Aguda sent around more than one mailer or one communique that, maybe could have been read as ambiguous or not clear, precisely because it does stress and break their coalition. So to me, this is a very important change, because it reinvigorated a line that people had thought had disappeared right? Or that everyone thought the world was organized this way, and it was for many issues. But now we get another set of issues on the table, and all of a sudden a different set of issues and different organization emerges. I'm going to go back to this view. All right, so and this plays out what I would call over the later COVID months. So now we've got the politicization of COVID itself and the restrictions, and you've got a split in the Orthodox community about COVID, about halacha and state law. Here you have a picture of the famous or infamous mask riots in Chol Hamoed Sukkot in Brooklyn, right, where they gathered in the streets and they burned masks, sort of in defiance of both state and medical authority. And this is exactly the kind of activity that unites, right, sort of right-wing modern Orthodoxy, maybe even modern Haredism and leftward, and really breaks right in that middle of that Aguda coalition. Same thing, here is a wedding in Satmar on November 8th. And as you can see, apparently there were anywhere between 10 and 15,000 people at the Rebbe. I think it was the wedding of the grandson of one of the Rebbes. Now, what people have pointed out is that the arguments here are very interesting. I have not been able to find, I don't want to say it doesn't exist, but I did do a fair amount of searching to find a kind of formalized halachic tshuva explaining why it is that this wedding is okay. In other words, Rav Asher, Rav Schechter have written and published and spoke many, many, many times about their view of the world. But when you look for the halachic analysis that's opposing them, I have trouble finding it. Again, not like little statements here and there or little kokoris, but a sustained halachic analysis of, wait a minute, isn't there at least a safek pikuach nefesh here? And how is it that you're doing this? And two interesting things I think have emerged. One is that the arguments are not, if I think and say, okay, so what are these people thinking? Like what's going on there? I think the argument is sort of saying, no, you guys are looking at it wrong. You're looking at everything through this technical halachic sphere. But really, you have to look at it more holistically in terms of what are the components of Orthodox life, particularly Haredi Orthodox life. And that the idea of going to shul, to minyan, Shachris, Mincha, Maariv, of spending lots of time, particularly for men, right, in the base medrash, is the question is not like pikuach nefesh versus the value of learning in a base medrash. The question is, these are things that constitute what it means to be Orthodox. In other words, it's a lifestyle, right? And I think one interesting expression of this was in the summer when New York said you can't have camps, sleepaway camps. A group of camps sued the state of New York. They lost, but that's sort of less important right now. And they made the argument that like camp is an essential part of Orthodox life and therefore of religious practice. And they said, look, people become more religiously connected during camp, right? There are things that camp does that formal education school doesn't do, all of which are probably true, right? Now, this to me is like really interesting. It depends how you look at it, right? If you look at it in a narrow halachic sense, you say camp is not a halachic category. Well, what do you guys do in camp? What do people do in camp? That's religiously significant. They daven. You can daven not in camp. They learn. You can learn not in camp. They listen to shiurim. You can listen to shiurim not in camp. Right? There's nothing, right, other than v'hayam machanecha kadosh, right? There's no halacha of camp. But these people are saying, no, you're missing the point. Camp and things like that constitute the essence of what religious life is. And therefore, if you take that away, you're infringing on our religious freedom. Same thing with the wedding, right? So, yes, a wedding is deraita yotzein 2, and midarabanan 10. But really, right, particularly in, like, say, Hasidic circle, attending the wedding of the children and the grandchildren of the Rebbe is just, it's culturally and Jewishly significant, even if it doesn't fit into some halachic box. And to me, this is like a really, really interesting debate that emerged, which is how should we view this, right? is this a, do we look at this in a narrow halachic sense? Is this a technical halachic question? Second halachic question, it's hard to see how the analysis promoted by Rabbi Schechter and Rabbi Weiss isn't right. But if you say it's sort of missing the point, and it's about what makes Jewish life living like real and viable, then you begin to understand why camps, why 10,000 person weddings, why sort of shuls and base medrashas working the way they usually do is more significant. The other interesting shift has been what people have pointed out of the Americanization of the Haredi community. In other words, all of a sudden, the arguments are sounding less in halacha and more in American law. So you're infringing on our religious freedom. And we'll talk about the lawsuits in a minute. At these rallies, right, you heard political cries for liberty and don't tread on me and fear of government tyranny, right? All sorts of themes that are not Jewish, but American and very much tied up in our current culture wars. And you see that the American Haredi community very much sort of joining that and embracing that. After those protests, there were some interesting counter reactions. And now we're going to look at like debates, right? Just to go back to this slide for a second, right? That really are occurring sort of not on this part of the spectrum, but really within this sort of a good coalition part of the spectrum, or maybe the very edge of it. So Rabbi Weiss, Rav Usher, when he heard about this, he basically said, our faces are covered in shame. And when people pass away, he says, quoting, of course, the inverse of the quote from Sefer Dvarim, we can't say that Yadenu lo shafchu et adam hazeh, right? We're not going to be able to say we have nothing to do with this. And he was horrified on this and sort of like couldn't understand how people who are from Yari Shemayim would engage in this behavior. And his response was to give maybe the 2,332nd version of his shir making that point. Rav Meir Twersky of Yeshiva University, grandson of Rabbi Soloveitchik, wrote I think he's definitely an outlier, but I think he wrote an interesting letter that Rav Schechter signed on to at the end, sort of making the point that people have lost all proportion and really saying, you guys need to think about this halachically. He says, look, you've totally overstated the significance of minyan. Is minyan important? Yes, minyan is important. Is minyan a chiyuv d'oraita? No. Right? Is it a midah tova? Yes. So as you balance, right, safek pikuach nefesh against those things, he says all you people who are protesting and whatnot have way overstated the value of minyan. He says, you want to learn. That's very good. But what is the halachic differential between learning at home and learning in the base medrash with 1,000 people? Is it better? Yeah, maybe it's a little bit better. But is it worth that risk? In his view, absolutely not. And then he went with a further theme that is actually a very an older Haredi theme. He says, look, guys, we live in Gullus, right? And I'll call this a theology of Gullus. And he says, in Gullus, and we'll see Rav Moshe Feinstein said something similar, or Schechter said something similar. In Gullus, we live on borrowed land and on borrowed time, right? We're here on a guest pass. In other words, he's not thinking of this at all in American terms of we're citizens and we have rights. And he's like, what are you provoking the government? And he writes this letter. He's like, I can't believe people are suing about camp. Like, are you guys, have you lost it? You don't understand that we're in Gullus? You think now we own the place? So what I find interesting here is I don't totally identify with that thesis, but it is interesting that within a very, I would say, conservative traditional world, you now have this point reemerge where people like Rav Meir Twersky and to a degree Rav Schechter are actually promoting a much older line of Haredi thinking of we're not really citizens, we're guests. And the more mainstream Haredi world is really picking up on a more Americanist view of we are citizens and we're going to pursue our rights in court, which we'll come to in a minute. So that's kind of one distinction. The other distinction is, are we asking technical halachic questions where we weigh each activity against its halachic benefit versus its pikuach nefesh dangers? Or are we looking at things of sort of the Orthodox lifestyle? And that the goal here is to maintain as much of the Orthodox lifestyle as possible. All right, so in the last bit here, we'll transition to part 3, which is the suits, the lawsuits that eventually went up in one version or another to the Supreme Court. I'll try to just give a little bit of background and sort of talk about what's been happening. And what may happen is things will certainly develop along these routes. We're really at the beginning of this. So after Governor Cuomo of New York initiated a variety of restrictions, there were different zones. I don't want to get into all the facts here, but basically in certain places it meant that no more than 10 people can gather for religious services, and in some places no more than 25. And then there were also limits on the capacity percentage of how many people could be, what percentage of capacity could be in the room. The Aguda, along with the diocese, the Catholic diocese in New York, sued the state of New York in federal court. And then just a little lawyer technicality here, right? Lawsuits like this will take a long time to sort out. So what you can do is you can apply for a preliminary injunction to say, while we're figuring out who's going to actually win or lose this case, we want the court to stay or to prevent or to enjoin the government from enforcing these restrictions. And that's called, different words for this, but we call that a preliminary injunction. So the district court said, no, we're not going to give you that injunction. The Court of Appeals, the Second Circuit in New York, also said no. And then that went up to the United States Supreme Court. It's pretty rare for the Supreme Court to kind of take questions like this, but they did. And whereas earlier in the summer, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on the court had similar-ish cases, and basically in 5-4 said, no, we're not going to grant this preliminary relief, right? And here we are now. Amy Coney Barrett has replaced Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and now the court 5-4 granted this relief to the Aguda. And now they're going to still litigate the case and figure out the contours of this, of the doctrine. Now, because it's preliminary, lots and lots of questions are not answered, right? They basically give a short version of saying, okay, we're just going to hold application of these regs while we go and figure it out. But they did give some reasoning that's worth thinking about. The Aguda's briefs basically raised two types of claims. First, they said, look, you're targeting specific Jews and Jewish religious activities, right? Blaming the governor of New York and a whole bunch of statements, basically saying you're targeting us. And then they're saying, as a more general matter, you are disfavoring religious gatherings as compared to secular gatherings. And more or less, the courts have largely stayed away from the question of whether Jews were specifically targeted and based themselves on things that are, of more general applicability, with saying, okay, what can, what happens when we have religious gatherings and compared to secular gatherings? How does that work? So as I think about it, the debate between the majority dissent, or between the different opinions here, boils down to this. The majority basically says that a religious group's going to win if there are at least some secular activities that are treated better than religion. In other words, they say what the Constitution says you can't do is you can't treat secular things better than religion. So therefore, since the state of New York allowed liquor stores and bike shops and acupuncture parlors and other things called essential businesses, it said those can be open. What the majority of the justices said is, yeah, well, if those are open, then religions have got to have at least those same of rights. Because what you're doing is you're impermissibly discriminating against religion vis-a-vis these secular pursuits. And therefore they say things like this have to be under what lawyers call strict scrutiny review, which means that judges got to look really, really closely and say, is there a very good reason that you're not putting religion in the most favored category? The dissent kind of comes at it from the other direction. And they say, no. If the government can point to secular activities that are also restricted, then religion can also be restricted. In other words, the state will win if it can show there's secular activities treated equally or worse than religious activities. And they said, look, New York prohibited lectures and concerts and movies and sporting things. And they said, look, anything that's like a bunch of people come at one time and they stick around for a while and then they leave, we've prohibited. And that's exactly what religious worship is. And therefore they said, listen, that these are subject to what's called rational basis review. In other words, as long as like there's a credible reason for this, it's going to pass. And that is, I think, the core of the debate is sort of like, does religion have to be in the most favored class of secular activities? Or if you can point to secular activities that are sort of like the religion, that are also being restricted, can religion belong to those? It's obviously more nuanced and complicated, but I think that's the guts of it. The real difficult question here, of course, which all the justices deal with, is, how do you measure the value of religious activity vis-a-vis a secular activity, right? How do you compare the value of Shacharis to any one of these other things? So in some sense, it's a very difficult question, because these secular things, we think as a society, we've sort of, we have at least parameters for how to measure them. But then you put in a religious thing, and to some people it's utterly meaningless, and to some people it's the most important thing in the world. And this is why these cases are so different, because inevitably you're evaluating things by saying what's important enough to be open, what's not. But how do you value a thing that we don't have any accepted, agreed upon parameters to value? And more than that, some would say the courts are not allowed to get into that question. And then the question is, well, what happens when they're not allowed to get into that question? So let's drop more at the opinion. So the opinion itself, it has it's basically issued in the name of the court, and then it has a few concurrences and a dissent. And I try to summarize the guts of it. So they say, look, Aguda and the churches tell us without contradiction that they've complied with all public health guidelines, and they've implemented additional precautionary measures and are operating at reduced capacity. And then they say, why is it that attendance at houses of worship is limited to 25 persons, even though non-essential businesses can decide for themselves how many persons to admit? In other words, it's going to look to these other things that are happening that are secular. Those are permitted. Religion's discriminated against, and therefore you can't do that. Justice Gorsuch sort of went on this, but I think came up with a little more sharper edged line of reasoning. This is kind of interestingly included this. It's not really necessary for the holding, but he says, look, in Orthodox communities, if you're going to limit it to 10, then that means you can't have any women come, because you're needed again to have 10 men for the minyan, and therefore you're not going to have any women come. So that's kind of interesting that it made it in there. Not really relevant to the holding. But basically he says, look, the restrictions apply no matter what precautions are taken, even if they social distance, even if they wear masks. Doors and windows are open, no singing, they disinfect, right? And then they say, but this is the guts of it. He says, look, the governor has chosen not to impose no restrictions on certain businesses that the governor considers essential. Again, our hardware stores, acupunctures, liquor stores, bicycle repair shops, signage companies, accountants, lawyers, insurance agents, right? According to the governor, it may be unsafe to go to church, but it's always fine to pick up another bottle of wine, shop for a new bike, spend the afternoon exploring your distal points and meridians. I assume this gets something to do with acupuncture. Who knew public health would so perfectly align with secular convenience? That's probably the line that kind of sticks out from here. Basically saying New York's just playing favorites because it likes these things more than others. And therefore, Gorsuch again signs on to that opinion and says you can't do this, and basically issues the injunction allowing religious services to continue. The main dissent is by Sonia Sotomayor, who basically says, look, we decided these cases earlier this summer, all but saying when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was here and Amy Coney Barrett wasn't, and we reached different results. And those cases told us how to do this, right? That they may restrict attendance at house of worship so long as comparable secular institutions face restrictions at least as equally strict, right? And therefore they say, look, we say no concerts, no lectures, no movies, no sports, no theatrical performance. And again, anytime you got a bunch of people coming together for extended periods of time. And from a secular perspective, that's what shul looks like, right? Shul looks like a bunch of people come, they sit for a designated period of time, and they all leave. That's like all these other things. And therefore, right, we don't treat, the only thing we treat more leniently are grocery stores, banks, laundromats, places that aren't like shuls at all, because people don't congregate there in large groups or remain in close proximity for extended periods. And she said that would decide this case, but of course that's That's not the majority rule. So to back away a second from the Supreme Court, what's interesting here, and to kind of turn it back to what I would think of as the shifting sort of tides and theories of the American Orthodox community. There's a tshuva from Rav Moshe, again echoed by Rabbi Twersky in a certain sense, and Rabbi Schechter also. This is of course from a while ago, but the issue there was should the community in England sue the English government in the European courts for not providing funding to Jewish schools. Basically, to sue the government on some version of a kind of religious equality claim. Of course, not American law, but through European Union law. And Rav Moshe Feinstein says, you should definitely be permitted and encouraged to lobby government officials to get money for the schools and whatnot. But he thinks it's a very bad idea to sue the government for fear of ava, of hatred towards the Jewish frum community. And he says, he quotes the famous line that gets repeated a couple weeks ago, always in the Parshas Zveis Yaakov, the Halacha Esav Sones Yaakov, right? Jews are gonna not like, non-Jews are gonna hate the Jews, even if in the Malchus Shel Chesed, even if they're generally nice. And therefore, you're poking the bear in the eye by suing them and entering this political fray, and you shouldn't do it. It was interesting in a podcast, the Headlines podcast, which is sort of run by David Lichtenstein and geared towards the Haredi community. He's always interesting. So he had some Aguda representatives on, and he sort of threw this language of Rav Moshe at them. He said, "What do you say?" And they basically said, "Well, yeah, that's what Moshe said in the 70s or whatever it was, but times have changed, and we've asked our Das Torah and who recommended going ahead with this suit." Rav Schechter said something very similar just 2 nights ago. He said to sue the government is unheard of in the Jewish tradition. He also said something which I think is a little, I'm not sure I agree with. He said, this is a Christian country, they could outlaw all other religions. But the point is, and this is what, if we talk about some of these inversions, right? These are, I would say, a generation or two ago, these were classically Haredi ways of viewing it, that Jews are not really citizens of America. They don't have rights. They are guests here. And you know what a guest should do? Say thank you and not stir up trouble. And what you see now is that the Haredi community, the Aguda, very much adopting a very sort of American view of itself and of the system. Say, we're Americans, we have First Amendment rights, and we're going to pursue them, and we're not worried about the backlash politically or socially. I just want to close here by sort of thinking about the interaction between what I call legal logic and halachic logic. So the way the courts have understood it is that when a religious believer or a community makes a claim, a religious claim, the court is not supposed to go and say, is that true according to your religion? Is that an accurate reading of your religion? Even if 99 people say, no, that's crazy. If this guy sincerely believes it, or this community sincerely believes it, then for these purposes, that is the religion. And this is just actually from, note the date here, this was a case decided yesterday when the Supreme Court kicked it down to the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit sort of expanded the injunction against some of the New York regulations. But I thought this line was interesting, right? That the court below concluded that the Agudath Israel had not demonstrated irreparable harm because its congregants could continue to observe their religion with modifications. Meaning, of course, no one's saying you can't daven. No one's saying you can't daven with a minyan. We're just saying you got to daven with a minyan of 10 or 25, whatever it is. But, and you hear the argument behind it, since everybody says that a minyan of 10 is a perfectly valid minyan, how are you really harmed? And the court says this is an error, right? Quotes a Supreme Court case, says it's not within the judicial ken to question the centrality of particular beliefs or practices to a faith. The validity of particular litigants' interpretation of those, or the validity of particular litigants' interpretation of those creeds. So, and again, I sort of previewed this hypo before. So suppose somebody comes and says in the American courts that, look, there's a Jewish law principle of Berov Am Hadras Melech, right? Meaning that the bigger the minyan, the better it is. And therefore, we need a minyan of 1,000. What you can't do is bring in, 9,000 rabbis all saying that no, 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 no. I mean, yes, such a thing exists, but that's not really all that important. And that certainly is not doche pikuach nefesh. In other words, you can't engage the halacha. From the perspective of the American courts, again, there's some exceptions to this, but basically, if you sincerely profess it, which I think here is not difficult to show, for the American courts, that's the religion. And therefore, they're going to take that as religion, and then they're going to ask, okay, is there a compelling state interest nevertheless? But what I think is important to conclude here is that while that might be a good American law argument, that doesn't make it a good halachic argument. And I think as Jews, we should be attuned to the halachic arguments of things like this and to say, really following, I think, the poskim of our community, that there are issues of pikuach nefesh here. And just because, and I think this is the point, that here's where these two divide, just because in American law, we say the American courts do not have the capacity to assess that religious claim. That doesn't mean that we internally don't. And I think our shul has been quite admirable in our halachic leadership in figuring out what the lines are and implementing, of course, with all the difficulties they entail and the lack of certainty. So I think we'll hold it there. And I hope, just to conclude, we sort of basically did three things, right? To go back to the outline, right? Sort of like what happened in early COVID, what was the halachic analysis that drove most of that, and that was sort of almost universal for a couple months, and then in the summer you start seeing the shifting fault lines, and that immediately implicates both questions about whether these are fundamentally social questions or halachic questions, and then I think you saw a certain inversion, whereas typically the community that sort of flies under the banner of halacha actually saw this much more socially, whereas the sort of other parts of the community really stuck to a halachic analysis. And then as you move into the courts, a real kind of shift in who's seeing themselves as Americans in the kind of fullest sense of the word and speaking the language of American law and American rights, and who's sort of looking at this more halachically in terms of what we ought to be doing as we balance, as we try to live through what hopefully will be a not much longer until we could return to practice everything lechatchila and mahadrim mina mahadrim. So I'll pause.